is mentioned as a crime against humanity. That's where I would put it. Now, clearly there are places where it overlaps with genocide, but I think in general that's not genocide. Sure.
Yeah, very short. I wanted to, I guess, to clarify a little bit my question, of course, the slave trade, but also the institution of slavery. I'm thinking about Orlando Patterson, for example, and the idea of slavery as social death. The fact that so many slaves actually almost envied those who died because many, it was seen kind of structurally as a fate worse than death.
Again, I don't want to make any excuses whatsoever for slavery, right? But the way I define genocide and the way the courts define genocide, I think is appropriate. Again, not exclusively so. I don't, there are other kinds of deaths, right? And there are other kinds of horrible fates. But this particular crime of eliminating a group of human beings, part or all of them, as such, in other words, trying to destroy that group, again, for me, ranks as a kind of crime of crimes, the worst thing that can be done in the international scene. And the slavery you describe and all the horrible things that it implies, and that it not just it implies, that we know about it, belongs in a terrible area of the crimes against humanity, which in and of themselves are prosecutable today.
Okay, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. I'm Saskia Wieringa. I'm the chair of the People's Tribunal on Indonesia. And I would like to know what lessons you have learned from your studies on how to break the cycle of violence.
I mean, it's obviously a crucial question, and a question I get a lot, and one that I can't answer very well. I explained to the students this morning, 5 years as an historian, a practicing historian, and teacher in the university, and I have no easy prescriptions. And I've studied genocide since the mid-90s. I have no easy prescription on how you do it. I think what has been done, meaning the formation of courts, to try people, call them to responsibility for their acts. I think the work of the press is crucial in sort of publicizing what's happening. For example, in Myanmar, we're learning every day new things about what's going on with the Rohingya. We talked earlier today about the responsibility to protect. I think that's a good measure, which was developed at the end of the 90s after Kosovo, and the successes or the perceived successes in Kosovo, and then adopted by the UN. I think that was great that it was adopted by the UN. I was surprised and pleased that everybody, the General Assembly, signed on to the responsibility to protect. I think the ICC, collecting data now on Syria, and we know they're collecting, and one day maybe somebody will be brought to account for the terrible crimes that have been committed in Syria. So all of this is useful. Also, the kind of training that people do about prejudice, about othering, about diminishing other peoples. These are all, as I mentioned, stages in the genocidal process. So it's important to step in. And then the whole issue of war. I'm convinced, it's extremely important not to fight wars because they tend, again, to breed genocide. So I think there are a series of things, but in terms of a prescription, I'm afraid I have none.
Yeah, hello, I'm Simon Aerts, a history student. Thank you for your lecture, and I was wondering what you have to say about the relation of genocide and ethnogenesis to one another, and how this plays out essentially in memory of nations, of nationality, because many peoples, of course, were formed in the crucible of genocide.
That's an interesting question. I might put it a little bit differently. In other words, I don't think nations are formed by genocide. I think but I think you're right that genocide contributes to the way people think about their groups and their nations. I mean, if you take, again, the Armenians, what happened in 1915 is absolutely crucial to how they think about themselves as a nation. You take Bosnians. I mean, it became the genocide that occurred in the war in the 90s became a crucial part of how they think about themselves as a nation. But it doesn't mean that the Armenians or the Bosnians or others were not developing themselves as nations before. See what I mean? So do you have examples of a people that was created by genocide?
The ones committing the genocide.
Those who committed genocide?
Yes.
Well, that's also true. I mean, it works the other way as well. I mean, in the case of the Germans, I mean, it's hard to imagine Germany and how it thinks about itself without having committed the genocide. And it's actually hard to think about the Turks without denying genocide, right? Although I'm beginning to get there, because there are actually quite a few Turks who are ready to admit there was a genocide. So it works both ways. I mean, the genocide story or the episodes or the history of genocide certainly plays its role in the creation of how peoples think about themselves and how they evaluate themselves. Let me just tell you one little story in this connection. I had a very good friend at a research center at Stanford who was a Native American, a sociologist by the name of Joe Goins, a wonderful guy who worked on Native American, the problems in Native American reservations with alcoholism and child abuse and drug use. I mean, it's really a terrible, terrible social problem that Native Americans have for a variety of different reasons. And he and I argued over a course of this whole year. He said, I don't want to hear about genocide. So it's an excuse that our people use not to get their act together. And I said, but it's part of who they are and their history. He says, it's part because you're telling them it's part of who they are, their history. So you can go back and forth about this, but I do think that, I think the question is a very interesting one, and but clearly genocide, and also for the perpetrators, is part of identity. Part of identity.
Okay, I'm not a professional historian, but I have many questions, but by far most important is the following one. Are you aware of a single case of a genocide being stopped or prevented thanks to our awareness of,
well,
of genocide?
Good question. You never know, of course, if you step in and the processes that look like they might lead to genocide are stopped. But, so you never know, right? Because you never know whether they stopped them or whether there wasn't going to be a genocide in the first place. But let me give you an example. Kosovo, right? In Kosovo, 1999, the Serbs, right, were attacking. I mean, we had the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was attacking some Serb military stations in counterinsurgency actions on the part of the Serb government, led by Milosevic, right? And the Serbian army. They destroyed villages, a couple of massacres, serious ones. It looked, the Western community, and by this I mean especially Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, had looked really bad as a result of Bosnia in the first place and Srebrenica. I mean, they had been so badly mauled politically, in my view, again, make it my view, by Milosevic, that they were ready to act. So they acted, and we bombed the Serbs. I mean, unfortunately, we also bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and took down some bridges and things like that. We didn't need to do that, but we stopped the Serbs in their tracks. What was happening, what I would describe, was a form of ethnic cleansing. And you remember that because of our Albanians were fleeing across the border into Macedonia and Albania, and we stopped that process in its tracks. Could there have been genocide? I believe there could have been. Would there have been? We don't really know. So, but it's a good example of action on the part of the international community, which was taken, actually, not just ostensibly, was taken. I mean, partly to make up for the fact that we'd been embarrassed by Bosnia, but partly to stop genocide. So there's a good example. And by the way, out of that then came the responsibility to protect. Because people said, whoopee, we've got something here. And now we're going to set up, we're going to put up we're going to construct, a template whereby in the future we can stop it again. And we'll all agree on it. That didn't necessarily happen.
In Africa, we can't stop in Africa.
Well, some things, yeah.
In Africa, we can't stop.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Petr Finci. I'm a student at Holocaust and Genocide Studies. You, I believe, rightly said that one process was stopped in Kosovo in 1999. However, another one, I believe, was...
I have to move closer.
Okay. Should I repeat? So I think you are completely right that one process was stopped in 1999 in Kosovo when Blair and Clinton moved in with NATO. I think, however, that another one was started, which was a precedent of intervention not sanctioned by Security Council, which led, I believe, to other atrocities. Would you agree?
Okay, where?
Well, in Iraq, if you like.
In where?
In Iraq, the alliance of the willing. I mean, the precedence of non-sanctioned military intervention, that NATO goes it alone, I think was created situations that we could have perhaps avoided. Okay. Would you care to comment?
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. Fair enough. But the question is, how do you balance that? In other words, how do you balance what you think and what we thought, if I get your question correctly, was a potential genocidal situation? And I think the reason they went in, and the reason the international community, in some senses, confirmed that they should go in, is that, that the ethnic cleansing that was going on had to be stopped.
Thank you. I'm Emmeline. I'm a student of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and I was there this morning when you mentioned, if I'm correct, governments shouldn't be a part of deciding what's a genocide and what is not. And I was wondering how you see that plan out in the future, where there's more and more globalization and trials after genocides, where multiple governments are involved in those trials, also if it's not their country. So I was wondering how you see that work out in the future.
Okay, can you do that once more again?
Yeah.
It's partly my hearing.
No problem at all.
And
no problem at all.
I was asleep last night.
I was wondering how you see governments meddling with the definition of genocide and using it as a political tool in the future. As you said, that's probably not what we all want, but it is what happens. So I was wondering how you see that in the future, and maybe if you have a solution for this meddling.
Okay, so the basic question about the use of genocide by various people or governments to justify their own points of view and their own political programs as a way, to push those in the international community or one place or another. All one can do, and I mentioned this morning too, as a scholar, is to try to say things as you see them, right? All you can do is say, no, I don't think that's genocide, for the following reasons, right? It's also true, I get caught. I fully confess, I get caught sometimes. I don't like the arguments very much about what are genocide and what are not. Let's go back to the question earlier about slave trade, right? What's a crime against humanity? What's genocide? What's a war crime? The kind of nitpicking that can sometimes go on. In the case of Darfur was a good example, right? Where the United States said, yes, this is genocide, and the UN said, no, it's not genocide, and in between the two of them, nothing was done, right? That's a perfect example about how you shouldn't get into that kind of an argument. At the same time, as someone who studies genocide and believes we need to study it, I think there are norms, and I think there are definitions, and I think there are ways to think about it. And by the way, another thing that's important to say in this connection is there is now a huge body of judicial literature about genocide. A huge body. We're talking tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of pages of very learned discussion about the finest points that there are about genocide. There is a kind of deep literature that can be referred to and can be talked about, can be discussed, can be argued about. And many of the claims of genocide just don't fit. So if you accept the international juridical definition kind of mixed with a historical definition, which I do, then you have a criteria for what's genocide. So if someone says, well, this awful slave trade, I say, no, that's not genocide. It's another kind of crime, terrible crime, that needs to be tried, right? And needs to be, blacklisted as best you can. But it's not the same as genocide. And it gets you into trouble. It just gets you into trouble all the time. We have a colleague in Bosnia, Besmirovic. You must know her. Has written a wonderful book on genocide in the Drina Valley. And she read one of the things I wrote earlier, and she may be right. She said, why do you just say Srebrenica's genocide? All along the Drina Valley, in these 5 or 6 communities, genocide was committed. And here's the data to show it. And she may well be right. I haven't gone into it. I haven't investigated it myself. I read her book. So we want to be careful, on the one hand, to hold the bar high and to have the definition a strong one and a purposeful one, and at the same time not to be rigid. So you have to try to do both things at the same time, which is impossible.
Sorry, thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Tiina Rootam. I'm from Estonia, a student. And I have a question about the process of healing of the people that have become victims of genocide. Have you noticed anything in your research about what happens after? And maybe some common traits in those processes?
It's a good question. I don't work on healing itself. I try to understand the acts and how the acts come about and how to think about them as acts. But obviously the healing question is a terribly important one. And I would just make a couple of observations. One is it takes a very long time sometimes. It takes a very long time. Healing can take a lifetime, even through generations. I just happened to read something, maybe it was a review of a new book about a Holocaust, about the daughter, from a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I can't remember her name. And I thought about what she said. And what she said is that this kind of trauma lives through generations. You know, it lives in me. And she wrote about it. And I thought to myself, well, that probably is true in some cases, especially in cases of, you know, Holocaust survivors and their progeny. I mean, there's been a lot of research on that, and that's true. Armenians, I mean, you can see, I mean, I've had a lot to do with Armenians and the Armenian community in California, which is a very big one. And, you know, there's still processes of healing going on and of dealing with trauma. In their case, not their trauma at all, but of great-grandparents who they never knew. And they heard from grandpa or grandma about it. So I would say and this goes to this question that I was mentioning about this friend of mine, this Indian sociologist too. I mean, how do you deal with the American Indians, you know, who clearly suffered a terrible set of events, you know, 150 years ago, mostly 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But still, you know, they feel it in their bones, you know, what happened to their peoples and to their land. And the resentment is enormous, and the anger and the trauma, which plays itself out, you know, in social problems in various kinds of ways. So, you know, I mean, the observation is this is an area that needs to be studied, and some people study it, and needs to be thought about.
Questions at that.
Okay.
So that we have the opportunity to actually speak with you more informally. I know I have a lot of questions, and I'm certain a number of you still have questions, but I think it's time for us to thank Professor Naimark for his insightful, very human reflections. He dares to call a spade a spade. I really appreciate the fact that you're not afraid to venture into areas that many of us just want to stop and not go there. So it's you set a wonderful example. Thank you so much for making the effort to come here today, for sharing these reflections. I can highly recommend the book. In fact, I will. It's going on to our syllabus. So thank you again. A warm round of applause. It's almost 5 o'clock in Amsterdam and in a lot of other places in the world, so the bar is open in the back at the reception.